What's happening, everybody? Ryan Thomas, live on the Thomas Take Sports podcast, bringing you another edition of me giving my take on some of the biggest headlines in the wide world of sports. And per usual, when I hop on the podcast, there could be a bunch of topics that I'll be talking about. Some of them can be the game itself. Some of it could be the fight itself, leading up to or post-fight, as I like to call it. And this really falls into a category in and of its own. I would consider this one a post-fight podcast. I would consider this one a reaction podcast to a first. And this is the first time I've ever really dived into the product that was Golden Boy MMA 1, which featured a trilogy fight as the main event with Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz. Two names that every single MMA fan, or combat sports fan, I should say, should know. Due to the fact these guys have had, storied rivalry throughout the last, 20 years in MMA. These guys have been pillars of the sport, pioneers of the sport, legends, and when we throw those words around like pioneers, legends of a sport in any case, that usually means that the fighter is old. And in this case, Chuck Liddell, 48 years old, Tito Ortiz, 43 years old. And talk of their third fight really dated back to their days in the UFC. They were opposite one another on The Ultimate Fighter, opposing coaches, where, for those of you that don't know, The Ultimate Fighter is a reality show in which two coaches that are already UFC fighters train UFC hopefuls, fighters that hope to be in the UFC one day and become the Ultimate Fighter. And they do a tournament to dictate who is the Ultimate Fighter. And during that season, Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz were the coaches. They went at it verbally, and ultimately Tito Ortiz pulled out of that fight due to a neck injury. Chuck Liddell fought what ended up being the last fight of his career, as we thought. At the time, that's what we thought, where Chuck fought Rich Franklin and was knocked out in his last fight. So Chuck retires. He comes off of 3 straight KO losses and ends his career. Tito Ortiz is enshrined into the Hall of Fame, wins a few fights over the years, then has a little run in Bellator, retires from MMA in Bellator, coming off of a win over Chael Sonnen, and we believed that he was done as well. So we had two guys here that we thought were done, but you have a third factor into this, and that is former boxing champion Oscar De La Hoya. De La Hoya, boxing promoter, Golden Boy Promotions, holds the biggest card in boxing right now, and that is Canelo Alvarez. And he wanted to dip his toes in the MMA waters, or so he says. And the first opportunity for him to do that was this fight. As ridiculous as that is, as cynical as that is, and as hilarious as that is, that Oscar De La Hoya thought that a successful event, really the first event, would feature Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz. That's what happened. These two guys got in the octagon wearing their patented trademark trunks, Liddell with the icicles as the Iceman, with Tito with the flames as the Huntington Beach bad boy. And they duked it out. And going into this fight, obviously, Chuck Liddell's 2 greatest signature wins in his career were against Tito Ortiz. Both were TKO victories for Liddell. And going into this fight, his main trainer, John Hackelman, said, "No, Chuck, I'm not training you for this fight. You shouldn't be fighting." A lot of us wondered, myself included, what Chuck Liddell had to offer, which was why I gave Tito the nod in this fight, for that reason only. You put Chuck Liddell in a cage versus Tito Ortiz at the height of their ability. Chuck Liddell wins twice. You put a 48-year-old man that has been knocked unconscious not once, not twice, not 3 times, 4 times in his last 5 fights going into the bout. That's the results that you're going to get. And as Richard Sherman once said, when you put a star receiver like Crabtree on me, that's the results you're going to get. Well, that's what happened with Tito Ortiz, and I'm not saying with Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell 3, and I'm not saying that Tito Ortiz is a substantially better fighter than Chuck Liddell. He's not. He's not, because history proved that. When they were at the height of their power, as I said, height of their skill level, Chuck knocked him out both times. When Chuck could take a punch, there were few fighters that were more dominant than Chuck Liddell in MMA history. But over time, the first thing to go is a man's chin, the last thing to go is a man's power. Chuck thought he could catch Tito and get another win and parlay that into whatever. I don't know what he was going to do after that. I hope not fight. That fight, watching it, was one of the saddest experiences I've ever had watching an MMA event. And I didn't buy it. There was no way I was going to donate my shouldn't say donate, but no way I was going to hand over my $39.99 towards an event that really shouldn't have even been taking place. The whole thing was a joke, a disaster. And it all starts with who's running the show. And that's Oscar De La Hoya running an event in which he thinks that he can just pluck off these old names and people will flock to it and he can make some money off of it. He saw this as an opportunity to dip his toes in the MMA waters and see if they would, if the water was warm, and it turned out that the water was cold. And you can use that pun for Chuck Liddell as well. Chuck Liddell thought that it would be a real easy swim, and he was treading water fast. You can use any swimming pool analogy that you want to throw out there. I'm going to use it for Chuck Liddell's ineptitude at fighting. He's not a fighter anymore. He hasn't been a fighter in 8 years. So to think that a guy was going to come back in after 8 years off against a guy that, despite the fact that Tito in his own right is 43 years old, for Pete's sake, he's no spring chicken either. This guy's old as well. But he had been more active. His last fight was a win against Chael Sonnen, whereas Chuck Liddell hadn't won in 10 years. Hadn't fought in 8, hadn't won a fight in 10. His last win was over Vanderlei Silva, who we could all agree shouldn't be fighting either. So, all that being said, watching this event was horrific. It was stomach-turning. It was everything that I do not want to see in MMA. And I'll start off with everything I don't want to see in MMA, featuring a promoter that has no business promoting the sport, a promoter that doesn't know the sport, a promoter that doesn't even know the fighters that are on his own card. In the midst of the promotion, Oscar De La Hoya is asked who else is on this card. He didn't even know. Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz had to bring about the other guys. Tom Lawler and Deron Winn. Lawler hadn't fought in the UFC in 3 years. Hadn't fought an MMA bout in 3 years. Deron Winn, a 5'7", short, fat wrestler. Oddly enough, coincidentally enough, trains with DC. Dominant victory, but no one really knew who he was. Then you have some old-timers like Jay Silva, old guys that have no business fighting. It was either an event that featured old fighters that had no business fighting and or young fighters that no one even knew about. It was horribly promoted, and I don't expect the pay-per-view numbers to be that great. I'll be shocked if they got over 100,000. Shocked. Be shocked if they got over 200,000. Tito Ortiz claimed that the pay-per-view buys were around 200,000. You suckered somebody, because that was not happening to me. I can tell you that. I love this sport. But I was not going to join this circus sideshow, circus act, cluster, you know what, of a show. It was a joke. And this whole angle that Oscar De La Hoya wants to make sure that MMA fighters get paid. No, he sees MMA as an avenue for him to get paid. That's all it is. He wanted to use two relics of the sport to get a little bit of a payday for themselves, one last decent payday, because rightfully so, they did not get paid in their heyday. Much like Johnny Bench hasn't made as much money as David Price in his baseball career. It's the same principle. The fighters, players that came before the heightened era that we are at in, let's say, baseball and MMA, they didn't make that money because they weren't fighting in this heightened era. It's time. As time passes, as the sport gets better and more popular, people that participate in it make more money compared to the people that were there starting out. Tito gallivanting and ranting and raving that this win is the win of his career. Meanwhile, he promoted the fight as if he said that he's going to prove that Chuck Liddell's a shell of a man. Why would he want to promote a fight saying that a guy is a shell of a man? If he beats him, he beat a shell of a man. Those were his words. Chuck Liddell, everyone and their grandma was telling him not to fight, and yet he just can't quit. I don't know how bad Chuck Liddell's money situation is. I hope it's decent. But I can't think of any other reason why a 48-year-old man who is one of the icons of this sport has the respect of each and every fan who has nothing to prove would continue to fight unless he wasn't motivated by money. But at the same time, I don't know if it's the reason why he came back to fight. I think this guy is so addicted to being in that limelight. He missed the spotlight, limelight, whatever you want to call it, and thought he could give Tito one last knockout. And it was a true shame to see a rivalry get tainted due to Oscar De La Hoya and Golden Boy MMA 1, an event that should have never took place, an event that we don't even know if we're going to get a sequel to this company. We don't know if we'll see many other events. Tito Ortiz says he wants to be the president of Golden Boy MMA. Good luck with that, Golden Boy. Good luck with that. And you know what? Oddly enough, I know a few people that work within the promotion, and I think they need to stick to boxing because MMA doesn't need any more organizations. We got enough. We got the UFC, we got Bellator, we got PFL, we got one championship. Those are 4 decent organizations. No more than that. I'm good. I'm cool. I'm okay with it. No more using old fighters to make money. Putting this false notion in their head that they'll make more money than they've ever made only to just look like shells of themselves and embarrassed. Makes me sick. And Dana White had every right to come out against Oscar De La Hoya and say what he said. Maybe he got a little too personal with it, but that's Dana White in a nutshell. He gets a little too personal about everything. But for Oscar De La Hoya to say Dana White shouldn't tell these guys when to retire, yes, he should, because at the end of the day, he's known these guys longer than anyone in the fight game. The Chuck Liddells, the Tito Ortiz, he managed those guys. So that's my take on all of this. And I really know for a fact that I'll keep you guys up to date on anything in regards to Golden Boy. I am interested to see if they'll have another event. It is an intriguing storyline, but it's not for the right reasons. It's for all the wrong reasons. I do not want to see this organization continue. I want to see this organization end with this one disgusting event. Call it quits, hang it up. Oscar De La Hoya has no business promoting mixed martial arts. Maybe if they bring in someone with MMA promoting ability, that would help. And maybe Tito does fit that bill in a way. But I don't think so. I don't think you can take an organization seriously with that guy running it. And I think that the event was a true shame.